Hello and welcome to The Understudy, the channel that teaches you everything about musical theater. My name is Philippa, and today I will read from Broadway Musicals, The 101 Greatest Shows of All Time by Ken Bloom and Frank Blasnick. To get the full version of the book, I recommend getting the physical copy as images and certain inserts from the book won't be displayed here. I do not own this material, I'm just reading from a place of entertainment and education, and I will not edit these audio recordings as I go, so you will get the unabridged version. Today we will go through Section L. La Cage aux Folles opened August 21st, 1983 at the Palace Theatre with 1,761 performances. Produced by Alan Carr, Kenneth D. Greenblatt, Stuart F. Lane, James L. Niederlander, Martin Richards, and Marvin A. Krause. Music and lyrics by Jerry Herman. Book by Harvey Feinstein. Based on the play La Cage aux Folles by Jean Poiret. Musical director Don Pippin. Vocal arrangements by Don Pippin. Music orchestrated by Jim Tyler. Dance music arranged by G. Harrell. Directed by Arthur Lawrence. Choreographed by Scott Salmon. Scenic design by David Mitchell. Costume design by Theoni V. Aldridge. And lighting design by Jules Fisher. Synopsis. Albin and George live a happy life. Days spent with their son Jean-Michel and evenings at La Cage aux Folles, where George is the MC and Albin transforms himself into the flamboyant drag queen Zaza. All is well until Jean-Michel, George's biological progeny, announces he is getting married. How do you present your two fathers to your fiancé's rabidly conservative parents? Lying seems to be the way to go, and Albin appears at the meeting of the in-laws dressed as Maman, in sensible shoes and pearls. Farcical proceedings abound until everything turns out well, all maintaining their pride. Cast: Georges, Jean Barry. Albin, George Earn. Jean-Michel, John Weiner. Anne, Leslie Stevens. Jacqueline, Elizabeth Parrish. Eoduard Dindon, Jay Garner. Marie Dindon, Merle Louise. After the smash hits Hello Dolly and Mame, Jerry Herman had a series of disappointments with Dear World, Mac and Mabel, and The Grand Tour. The first two, particularly, deserved a far greater success, but all three shows were a darker nature than the ever-sunny Dolly Levi and Mame Dennis, and audiences evidently expected the usual Broadway razzmatazz from Herman. Of course, there was much more than just glitz to those long-running smashes. Still, audiences wanted Herman to give them more and more of the same, while he yearned to expand his artistry. Luckily, along came La Cage aux Folles, and Herman was able to have it both ways. With equal doses of Broadway splash and political astuteness, La Cage aux Folles achieved the miracle of succeeding on both fronts. After an early fall start, titled The Queen of Basin Street, resetting the action to New Orleans and with a score by composer Maury Yeston, Herman joined the project and the show reverted to its original title as well as its Saint-Tropez setting. With a book by Torch Song Trilogy author and gay activist Harvey Fierstein and direction by the outspoken and highly politicalized Arthur Lawrence, La Cage might have easily become a polemic diatribe on gay rights. Herman's presence undoubtedly helped offset the other creators, balancing the scales between issue and entertainment, and telling a universal story on individuality and freedom of self-expression. Still, with a highly human story at its core, it wasn't easy making a gay-themed show palatable to the bridge and tunnel crowd without turning the characters into caricatures. One thing the audiences didn't want was a message shoved in their faces. They just wanted a big Jerry Herman musical with lots of hummable songs, a few tears, and lots of song and dance. The powers that be followed the rule of the Herman lyrics. I don't want praise, I don't want pity. And by delivering their sentience in a sweetly entertaining manner, the creative team made more of an impact than they ever could made with mere rhetoric. Their first act closer, I Am What I Am, recorded by singers as varied as Gloria Gaynor, Tony Bennett, and Pia Zadora, is a powerhouse tune, strongly sung by George Earn. But the reason the song truly brought the house down was the fully realized character behind all the bravado, a person driven to take a stand for himself, a notion that all people could relate to. It was a triumph for all involved, mainly its composer, for contrary to the then popular opinion, Jerry Herman was far from washed up, proving that despite the well-deserved reign of the Stephen Sondheim's Hal Prince collaborations, Herman's style of well-crafted, emotionally rich, snazzy Broadway was still necessary. In fact, with a dearth of new shoes being produced, audiences were hungrier than ever for the best of times in the theater. And Herman's innate optimism and unthreatening melodies were a breath of fresh air amidst all the thinking man's shows. For a certain element of population, that's what Broadway's all about. With its long run, you might think that the tale of La Cage aux Folles had a typical happy ending. It doesn't, for after all the rough treatment he had received through all the dark ages, enduring constant comparison with the more cerebral Sondheim, Jerry Herman was fed up. When the curtain rang down on opening night of La Cage, Herman walked out onto Broadway, the street to which he had devoted his entire life, vowing to himself never to write another Broadway show. He had nothing more to prove, and sadly, it's a vow he's kept for more than 20 years. No matter how many times Carol Channing promises that Dolly will never go away again, all of us, his fans and supporters alike, are the poorer that we will never have the special thrill of a brand new Broadway score by the master of the musical, Jerry Herman. Jerry Herman. As upbeat, unflatteringly optimistic as his songs, Jerry Herman is, in some ways, a walking Broadway show tune. As several off-Broadway reviews, Herman made his off-Broadway debut composing the score to Milk and Honey, perfectly geared to the Jewish theater party crowd. Next came The Show, with one of the songs, Hello Dolly. Given its legendary status, many are surprised to know that it was not smooth sailing for Herman out of town, and Bob Merrill came to Detroit to offer his advice on some of the stickier moments. Herman classically gave credit to Merrill for the lyrics ideas of Motherhood March and Elegance, just as generously returning the favor of writing 2 songs for Ben Franklin in Paris and 3 songs for Tommy Tune's A Day in Hollywood, A Night in Ukraine. A second smash, Mame, followed. During the late 1960s, it seemed as if Herman was the only game in town. In his next project, Herman and Angela Lansbury re-teamed on Dear World, a major disappointment considering the receptions of his prior shows. With another heartbreaking failure, Mac and Mabel, the unsuccessful movies of Mame and Dolly, made during the last gasp of the Hollywood musical, and his one true misstep, the Grand Tour, many wondered if Herman was washed up. This, however, the man who wrote the song I Promise You a Happy Ending, and in 1983, Herman had a career rebirth with La Cage aux Folles. Everyone hoped he would dive right into another Broadway show, but after writing the musicalizing Kaufman and Ferber's Royal Family, he decided better, preferring to leave the Broadway party on top. Then, in 1998, invigorated by an upturn of his health, Herman wrote his first major television musical in decades, with Angela Lansbury singing several jaunty tunes in the title role of Mrs. Santa Claus. Keeping his promise to stay away from Broadway, he wrote the concept album for Miss Spectacular and is still eyeing a run in Las Vegas. Whatever he sets his sight on, the best of times for Jerry Herman, to paraphrase German himself, is always now. George Hearn. The wonderful actor-singer George Hearn has had 3 distinctively different careers. Starting out as a budding opera singer, he segued into acting jobs, both in straight plays like The Changing Room as well as the occasional musical, a supporting role in A Time for Singing, a replacement John Dickinson in 1776. His Broadway musical career began in earnest when he was cast as the leading man of the I Never Miss a Liv Ullmann musical epic I Remember Mama. Despite its quick failure, he segued into the title role of Sweeney Todd, replacing Len Caro, later touring with the original star Angela Lansbury, and committing his powerful song Sweeney to a video for cable television. re-teaming with director Hal Prince, as well as Sweeney co-star Betsy Jocelyn and Edmond Lindeck in the interesting but unfortunate A Doll's Life. He bounced back and won a Tony Award for his star-making portrayal of Albin in La Cage aux Folles. In a complete 180 from a St. Tropez drag queen, Hearn next appeared as Long John Silver in Pieces of Eight, the Jules Styne musical version of Treasure Island that closed in Canada prior to Broadway. In a job that was more about a paycheck than a career move, he played the father in the gargantuan Meet Me in St. Louis. He finally found another juicy musical role as Max, the all-too dutiful manservant of Glenn Close's Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard, winning a second Tony in the process. In addition to continued dramatic work portraying Mr. Frank in the 1999 revival of The Diary of Anne Frank, Hearn's most recent singing appearance on Broadway was in the Sondheim Revue Putting It Together, playing husband to Carol Burnett and Kathy Lee Gifford at the Tuesday evening performance. Backstage, the television commercial for La Cage, written by gravel-voiced Harvey Fierstein, featured the gravel voice of Elaine Stritch. For all the producers' open-mindedness, the 10-story high billboard above the palace ironically featured a high-kicking, beautiful chorus girl, one of only 2 women in the 12-member cross-dressing team of Cagelles. George Hearn auditioned for the show singing My Heart Belongs to Daddy in full drag. Lady Be Good opened December 1st, 1924 at the Liberty Theater with 184 performances. Produced by Alex A. Ahrens and Vinton Friedli, book staged by Felix Edwardes, music by George Gershwin and lyrics by Ira Gershwin, book by Guy Bolton and Fred Thompson, orchestra under the direction of Paul Lennon. Orchestrations by Robert Russell Bennett, Charles N. Grant, Paul Lennon, Stephen Jones, and Max Steiner. Dance and ensemble staged by Sammy Lee. Settings designed by Norman Bell Jeds. Costumes by Kvyat Jenkins P. Leon. Synopsis. Dick Trevor is in love with sweet, simple Shirley. His sister, Susie, is in love with Jack Robinson, a down-on-his-luck Lothario. Jack, I'm just a poor hobo. Susie, then I must be in Hoboken. But the road to love is rocky, especially before the intermission. Dick, you see, is pursued by the rich and wanton Josephine Vanderwater. And Susie is cajoled into impersonating a rich Mexican widow whose husband was killed in an accident before leaving her his fortune. Unbeknownst to Susie, the widow, or the scheming layer who represents said widow, Jack is really the husband and is very much alive, having escaped the plot on his life. Jack is also really a millionaire. The audience is not surprised when Dick gets Shirley and Susie weds Jack. Cast: Dick Trevor, Fred Astaire; Susie Trevor, Adele Astaire; Jack Robinson, Alan Edwards; Josephine Vanderwater, Jane Auburn; J. Watterson Watkins, Walter Catlett; Shirley Vernon, Kathleen Martin; Jeff, Cliff Edwards; Pianos, Victor Arden and Phil Oman. Lady Be Good was George Gershwin's first great musical comedy. Perhaps the show's success was due to George's brother, Ira, collaborating with his brother on a full score for the first time. Ira seemed to inspire George to give freer rein to his melodies and forego completely any operetta influences that remained in his compositions. Lady Be Good might not have been as faddish and manic as Good News, which debuted a few years later, but it was certainly a musical of its time. The plot was breezy and verged on the silly. The voices of the cast, from Fred Astaire to Cliff Edwards, were opposite to the trained opera-like voices that warbled Romberg, Firm, and Herbert. Astaire and Edwards had a nonchalance and free-wheeling quality to their singing, and those qualities lent themselves perfectly in George and Ira's jaunty score. Fascinating Rhythm seems to have been George's breakthrough number with its bold unconventionality. Little Jazzbird and Hang On to Me saw George in a playful mood, keeping the tone light to a perfect match with Ira's witty, literate lyrics. By the time Lady Be Good went on to Liberty Theatre, 39 musicals had opened that year. There was to be one more, Princess April. Lady Be Good was Gershwin's fourth show of 1924. With so many shows opening, not to mention holdovers from past seasons, Broadway's theaters were fully booked. Lady Be Good's producers, Alex A. Aarons and Winton Freely, were lucky enough to get the Liberty Theater on 42nd Street. 42nd Street was the premier theater venue in New York, anchored by the New Amsterdam at the head of the block. The Liberty was designed by the same men who built the New Amsterdam. For the Liberty, architects Henry B. Hurt and Hugh Tallant were commanded by producers Marcus Claw and Abe Erlanger to make simplicity the byword. Since the property values on 42nd Street were so high, the theaters had long, narrow lobbies fronting the streets with theater houses proper on either 41st or 43rd Streets, where the real estate costs were much lower. When the Evening Post covered the opening, along with all the major New York dailies, the reporter opined, "Every seat on the 3 floors has a direct view of the stage, and one feels, no matter where on one is sitting, that there is no great distance between himself and the people back on the footlights." Impressive for the theater that seated 1,054 patrons. Most of the theaters of the time had an orchestra section, a mezzanine first balcony, and a second balcony. Before the advent of movies and television, audiences were not used to seeing actors up close, and they were content to sit far away from the stage, especially for 10 cents. Like most of the 42nd Street theaters, the Liberty fell on hard times when the Depression hit. Because of its popularity, it managed to stay open until 1933, when the poor economy won out and the Liberty became a grind movie house. Today, the theater sits behind a makeshift wall at the exit of AMC Empire Movie Theater. The lobby was demolished when the Empire Theater was rolled down 42nd Street to its present position. The Times Square redevelopment plan called for the theater to be used for nonprofit theater productions from around the country, but currently plans are afoot to turn the orchestra level into a restaurant. In its heyday, the Liberty was one of Broadway's most intimate theaters. It would seem, in this era of big barn-like auditoria with bad sightlines and worst acoustics, that a treasure like the Liberty would be cherished. But we don't have many small, intimate musicals like Lady Be Good, nor intimate performers like The Astairs, and Broadway isn't the same as it was in the heyday of 1920s. George and Ira Gershwin. George Gershwin's aggressive rhythms and blues-inspired melodies were a perfect match for his brothers Ira's ingenious rhyming and impudent humor. They constantly sought to expand the scope of the musicals whilst eschewing artiness and pretension. Their range included sophisticated reviews, George White's Scandal, smart bubbly musical comedies, OK, Lady Be Good, Funny Face, lightly satirical comic operettas, Let Them Eat Cake and Strike Up the Band, and a heartfelt emotional folk opera, Porgy and Bess. Gershwin began his career with a variety of lyricists including Arthur Jackson, George White's Scandals, B.G. De Silva, Sweet Little Devil, Odo Harbach and Oscar Hammerstein's second, Song of the Flame, and Brian Hooker, Our Nell, before teaming with his brother Ira, who originally used the pseudonym Arthur Francis, a name he created from the first names of his 2 siblings. George and Ira's perfectly attuned talents resulted in a remarkable body of work for both the stage and screen, and with George's composing talents extending to classical music. Ira also contributed lyrics to the music of Vernon Duke, Ziegfeld Follies, and Harold Arlen, Life Begins at 8:40. After George's death, Ira contributed to 3 more scores, Lady in the Dark and The Firebrand of Florence, both with Kurt Weill, and Park Avenue with Arthur Schwartz. Among the better-known Gershwin Brothers songs are Looking for a Boy, I Got Rhythm, Strike Up the Band, Bide in My Time, but not for me. There's a boat that's leaving soon for New York. I've got a crush on you, my one and only, and do do do. Backstage, financier Otto Kahn decided to invest $10,000 in Lady Be Good after hearing The Man I Love. Unfortunately, it was dropped before the premiere, although it was published under the name The Man I Love. Kahn didn't complain. He more than doubled his investment. Lady Be Good was the first Broadway show to have complete score by the Gershwins. Their Primrose had opened in London just prior to Lady Be Good. The show was originally titled Black-Eyed Susan, with Adele Astaire in the title role. She was considered the more talented of the dance team. Lady in the Dark opened January 23rd in 1951 at the Alvin Theatre with 467 performances. Produced by Sam H. Aris. Book by Moss Hart. Music by Kurt Weill. Lyrics by Ira Gershwin. Musical director Maurice Abravanel. Music orchestrated by Kurt Weill and vocal arrangements by Kurt Weill. Play staged by Moss Hart. Musical sequences staged by Hazard Short. Choreographed by Albertina Rash. Production design by Hazard Short and lighting design by Hazard Short. Seating design by Harry Horner. And costume design by Irene Sharaf. Gowns by Hattie Carnegie. Synopsis. Magazine editor Liza Elliott finds it increasingly difficult to make up her mind, whether on the job or in her personal life. She does decide to see a psychiatrist in order to get the root of her problem. Among her predicaments is the choice between marrying her lover, publisher Kendall Nesbitt, or her magazine's sarcastic advertising manager, Charlie Johnson. As the musical progresses, her dreams are illustrated and, little by little, Elliot finds the key to her problem and makes the right choice. Cast: Liza Elliott, Gertrude Lawrence; Miss Foster, Evelyn Wyckoff; Alison Dubois, Natalie Schaefer; Russell Paxton, Danny Kaye; Charlie Johnson, MacDonald Carey; Randy Curtis, Victor Mature; Kendall Nesbitt, Bert Lytell. Backstage. Transparent lucite panels were used on Broadway for the first time in Lady in the Dark. The brilliant scenic designer Harry Horner used the panels to make the transition between Liza's dream and reality. Decca Records released an album of songs from Lady in the Dark, sung by the incomparable Hildegard before the original cast album was even recorded. Gertrude Lawrence was incensed and threatened not to record her songs at all. The cast of Lady in the Dark included 56 performers. 51 stagehands were needed to move the elaborate settings. Moss Hart, Ira Gershwin, and Kurt Weill had a unique idea: make a musical in which all of the musical numbers take place in the lead character's subconscious. Out went the formula established by Showboat. Now, instead of just expressing emotion and advancing the plot, the songs have insight into a character's psyche. Lady in the Dark borrowed an idea from an older show, the operetta Naughty Marietta. Liza Elliott cannot complete the song My Ship. She remembers snatches of the melody and lyrics but can't quite put it all together. The cynical Charlie Johnson completes the song, and Liza recognizes him as her soulmate. In Naughty Marietta, the title character chooses between the dashing pirate leader and the Ranger's Captain Dick when the latter completes Aw, Sweet Mystery of Life, a song Marietta dimly recalls from her youth. Lady in the Dark also resembled Richard Rodgers and Lawrence Hart's Peggy Ann, both great dreams, sometimes surrealistically, an insight into their title's psyche. We're sure that Moss Hart, Ira Gershwin, and Kurt Weill didn't think of Peggy Ann when they set out to write Lady in the Dark. In fact, Hart began writing the musical in 1937 along with his frequent collaborator George F. Kaufman. The intended star was Marlene Dietrich. When Dietrich dropped out and Kaufman became busy with My Sister Eileen, Hart turned the idea into a straight vehicle for Katharine Cornell. The play, titled I Am Listening, was similar in form to Lady in the Dark, but before it could move to the next level, there would be a chance meeting between Hart and composer Kurt Weill at a birthday party for Walter Huston, star of Weill's Knickerbocker Holiday. Weill and Hart discussed the state of the musical and both agreed that the inspired libretto of the typical musical was beneath their interest. They wanted to write an innovative show like Rodgers and Hart's Pal Joey, in which the plot was advanced through song. Not the typical lame story with non-character specific songs dropped into the action haphazardly. Moss Hart brought up I Am Listening, and he and Weill came up with the idea that the patient's monologue to her therapist could be treated as musical numbers. Hart believed that they have found a new technique and a new musical form, and he dubbed it a musical play. Weill, Gershwin, and Hart's experiment paid off. Theater is an evolving art form. By being bold enough to try out new ideas, a trio advanced the musical theater another small step. Moss Hart. Moss Hart, author and director, began his association with musicals by writing Jonica in 1930 and Face the Music in 1932. After contributing sketches to As Thousands Cheer, he collaborated with George S. Kaufman on many successful plays, including You Can't Take It With You and The Man Who Came to Dinner, and musicals Jubilee and I'd Rather Be Right. Hart's lifelong fascination with psychoanalysis made him the perfect book writer for the struggles of Liza Elliott in Lady in the Dark. As the director of the smash My Fair Lady, he saved the job, and possibly the career, of Julie Andrews, shepherding her through the challenging role of Eliza Doolittle during legendary close rehearsals where he built her performance line by line and inflection by inflection. His last musical, Camelot, was a trial for all involved, sending most of the creative team to the hospital at one time or another during its genesis. Indeed, there are some who say its tortured birth process killed him. Danny Kaye. Danny Kaye, a brilliant but decidedly complicated movie star, also had a spotty but long-spanning career in musicals. He became a star with his turn as a mincing photographer in Lady in the Dark, in which he stopped the show with the tongue-twister Tchaikovsky. His first starring role, alongside other rising stars Vivian Vance, Nanette Fabray, and Eve Arden in Let's Face It, catapulted him to a 30-year stay in Hollywood, turning down the roles of Harold Hill in The Music Man and Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. Kaye didn't choose wisely when he finally returned to Broadway as Noah of Arc fame in 2x2 with the score by Richard Rodgers. Kaye found Broadway to have changed greatly since 1943. The collaborative aspect of musical theater was at odds with the more rigid hierarchy of motion pictures and the casual improvisational qualities of television, where he had complete control over the 4-year run of his CBS variety show. He was thoroughly unpopular with both cast and crew of 2x2, even screaming at fellow actors on stage during a performance. After breaking his leg, he returned to the show and performed first in a wheelchair, then on crutches, his behavior going from bad to worse. This tarnished his reputation as the warm and funny Hans Christian Andersen. Lil Abner opened November 15th in 1956 at the St. James Theatre with 693 performances. Produced by Norman Panama, Melvin Frank, and Michael Kidd. Music by Gene DePaul. Lyrics by Johnny Mercer. Book by Norman Panama and Melvin Frank. Based on cartoon characters by Al Capp. Musical director and continuity, Lehman Engel. Vocal arrangements by Lehman Engel. Music orchestrated by Philip J. Lang. Ballet music arranged by Genevieve Pitot. Directed and choreographed by Michael Kidd. Scenic and lighting design by William and Jean Eckert. Costume design by Alvin Colt. Synopsis. The denizens of Dog Patch lead their quiet hillbilly lives until they discover that the government plans to wipe them out due to their very unnecessariness. But Mammy Yoakum's Yoakum Berry Tonic proves to be a medical miracle, transforming scrawny men into muscle-bound hunks, but with the unfortunate side effects of eliminating their libido, just like steroids do today. With the discovery of a proclamation by none other than Abraham Lincoln, the day is saved for Abner. Daisy May, Moonbeam McSwine, Romero Scragg, and the other dog Patchians. Cast: Daisy May, Edith Adams, Lil Abner, Peter Palmer, Marion Sam, Stubby K, Mammy Yoakum, Charlotte Ray, Jen Bullmoose, Howard St. John, Pappy Yoakum, Joe E. Marks, Stupefying Jones, Julie Newmar, Earthquake McGoon, Bern Hoffman, Moonbeam McSwine, Carmen Alvarez, Appassionata von Climax, Tina Louise, Evil Eye Fleagale, Al Nesser. Lil Abner is simply one of the funniest, cleverest shows ever. Sharply drawn characters, sprightly music by Gene DePaul, hilarious and satirical lyrics by Johnny Mercer, and ridiculous, all too timey or timeless book by farce master Norman Panama and Melvin Frank. Inventive witty choreography by the deeply underrated Michael Kidd, pointed, precise, and perfect orchestrations by Michael Lang, and wonderfully broad, unwinkling performances. It's like will never be seen again. New York City Center Encore series recently tried a concert version of Lil Abner with rather dire results. And who got the blame? The show, of course, with many in the audience at City Center cursing Lil Abner of being a not very good or funny show. No matter the performances and production teams couldn't master the tone or begin to understand the sweet, wry, non-ironic style necessary to the piece. Dated is the all-purpose word for shows that the audience just doesn't understand, never pausing to consider that they, in fact, are the ones who might be dated, unable to take on the mindset of an older, different tradition of theater. It's like when modern audiences laugh at the emotive excesses of silent movies. Operetta audiences are sophisticated enough to view operas for what they are and accept them on their own terms. Otherwise, every single one would be dubbed as dated. Musical comedies, especially the truly funny kind, sometimes get short shrifts on Broadway, while message musicals win the critics' approval. Of course, it wasn't always this way. There was a time when shows could do anything to get laughs, with no restraints on their endeavor to please. Think of some of the funniest musical comedies. Hella Spoopin', Little Me, Whoopi, Coconut, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Two on the Aisle, Sugar Babies, Off-Broadway's The Mad Show. With the exception of Forum, they are seldom revived. Admittedly, most were star vehicles tailored to the talents of such veterans as Olsen and Johnson, Sid Caesar and Edie Cantor or the Marx Brothers, but they made audiences positively rock with laughter. Perhaps the triumphs of the producers will help put the comedy back in musical comedy. And if that happens, will we be able to pull it off? Doubtful, since the kind of clowns Broadway once employed to such success no longer exist. Whereas comics of the past captured the energy and vitality of the city, even when they were born in the sticks. Performers today are weaned on television and film, both cool media. The days of working week in and week out in front of vaudeville and burlesque audiences, honing one's skill, are gone. Two, with the advent of microphones, a high-level physical energy is no longer required. And, as a result, most modern comics are more passive than their predecessors. Broadway has slowly slid, for the most part, into a non-threatening blandness. There's a reason many of the great comics of the past were first-generation Americans, and often Jewish. They needed to be accepted, and acceptance was gauged by applause and laughter. And as the replacement cast of the producers have shown, there just ain't a lot of really funny, really dynamic performers who naturally have that kind of attack. That's why Nathan Lane is wooed back to reprise his role of Max Bailstock at sums unheard of in the annals of actors' equity. Luckily for us, we have the film version of Lil Abner, faithfully recreating the raucous hilarity of one of the musical theater's great silly achievements to remind us of a time when that kind of exuberance was as a typical day in Dog Patch, USA. Michael Kidd. Michael Kidd, choreographer and director whose high-energy dances brightened many Broadway musicals from the 1940s through the 1970s, made his debut in 1947 with Finian's Rainbow and two Nanette Fabray shows, Love Life and Army and the Girl. In numbers such as The Crap Shooter's Dance, Quadrille, and Every Once in a While from the hits Guys and Dolls, Can and Destry Rides Again, respectively, Kidd created a new dance vocabulary with his gymnastic, sometimes treacherous routines. He was not above controversy, getting in much publicized fisticuffs with both Destry star Dolores Gray and her mother. After Destry, he had disappointments with projects like Wildcat, Subways Are for Sleeping, Here's Love, Breakfast at Tiffany's, and Skyscraper, none of which exploited his exuberant character and situation-driven choreography. His most startling work was subtle, elegant staging of The Rothschilds, completely unlike his previous work and evidence of the growth and maturation of a deeply talented man whose unfortunate choice of properties in the 1960s kept him from the elite club of Jerome Robbins, Bob Fosse, Gower Champion, and Michael Bennett. Stubby K. Stubby K made his presence known with the claration tenor voice and his poorly frame after raising the roof nightly with Sit Down, You're Rockin' the Boat, as Nicely Johnson in Guys and Dolls. He became a star with his showstopper Jubilation T. Corpone in Lil Abner. After a sojourn in Hollywood, playing among other roles a banjo-playing, singing narrator alongside Nat King Cole in the film Cat Below, and a mini-character in London starring in musicals and television, he returned to Broadway for two short runs, sounding much the same as he did in 1950. First in the Abe Burrows revival of Good News, singing Keep Your Sunny Side Up, then in Hal Prince's Grind as a burlesque performer whom time has passed by. Backstage. Originally to be written by Alan J. Lerner and Arthur Schwartz, Lil Abner was then planned for Lerner and Burton Lane. After Charlotte Rae was cast as Mammy Yoakum, Billy Hayes became a sensation in New Faces of 1956. The producers wanted to replace Rae with Hayes, but Rae had a contract and wouldn't budge. They even went so far as to cut her song. When the tour and movie came up, Hayes got the part. Broadway houses. The history of theaters devoted to musical theater is also the story of Times Square. But as the musical comedy was in its infancy, so too was the area where 7th Avenue crossed Broadway. The area was originally named Longacre Square, and its main industry was carriage production. Where the Winter Garden now stands was Tattersall's American Horse Exchange. In fact, during the early years of the Winter Garden, when the show flopped, the critics claimed they could still smell the horses. By 1893, New Yorkers were spending $6 million a year on entertainment, and producers saw dollar signs in the theater development. In 1895, Oscar Hammerstein I built his Olympia Theater complex just as electric lights made their way up the square. In 1904, New York Times built its headquarters exactly the same on the square, which was renamed for the paper. Early owners of theaters were the dreaded Theatrical Trust of Claw and Erlanger, and their main rivals, the Schubert brothers, with noted developers, the Cannons, also building an impressive number of houses around the square. By the 1927-1928 season, the busiest in Broadway history, 257 shows opened in the area's 71 theaters. With the invention of motion pictures, additional theaters were built on Broadway as the flagships of major studios. During the 1930s, the Depression hit Broadway hard. The Schuberts lost many of their theaters to foreclosure and promptly brought them back at reduced prices at bank auctions. Many theaters were converted to radio and later television studios or became burlesque houses. And when Major LaGuardia outlawed burlesque, many of the theaters on 42nd Street became grind movie houses. The 1950s and 60s were relatively calm periods in the history of Broadway theaters, but the 1970s and 80s saw crime escalate and the theater district became a haven for drugs and prostitutes. Many of Times Square's landmarks were demolished, further adding to the woes of the neighborhood, with the skyscrapers that replaced them destroying the low-rise ambience in the area. During this period, zoning changes made it more profitable to build in the area and, despite the best efforts of preservationists, the Helen Hayes, Bijou, Morosco, Astor, and Victoria theaters were demolished. Major Koch, the man who was the man most responsible for selling out to developers, promised a renewed Times Square, but a stock market crash in October 1987 put the plans on hold. It was the Walt Disney Corporation refurbishment of the New Amsterdam Theater that proved to be the most important catalyst in the renovation of the 42nd Street. The resurgent economy, especially during the Clinton presidency, as well as the emergence of popular musicals, usually British and produced by Cameron Mackintosh, provided momentum. More theaters were lost despite the improved economy, although a few new theaters were built, including the Uris, now Gershwin, in 1972 and the Minskoff in 1973, and the Marquise in 1986. These theaters are badly designed, however, with poor sightlines, a huge barn-like auditoria, and severe acoustic problems, not to mention the fact that they are architectural eyesores. The Ford Center, on the lot once shared by the beautiful Lyrics Apollo Theaters, opened in 1998 and proved to be just as ill-suited to theatrical purposes as its modern predecessors. Meanwhile, the Liberty and Times Square theaters on 42nd Street remain empty, and the Intimate Empire, Eltinge, theater serves as the lobby for a movie complex. The great musical theater houses of the past, the Majestic, the Imperial, the St. James, the Richard Rogers, the Schubert, the Palace, and the Broadway, help to keep the great history of Times Square alive for future generations. Little Johnny Jones opened November 7, 1904 at the Liberty Theater with 52 performances. Produced by Sam H. Harris, music, book, and lyrics by George M. Cohen, orchestra under the direction of Charles J. Gebest, orchestrations by Charles J. Gebest, and directed by George M. Cohen, scenic design by W. Franklin Hamilton, costumes by Madame Freisner, Lord, and Taylor. Synopsis. Johnny Jones, an American jockey, arrives in England set to ride the horse Yankee Doodle in the Derby. He is charged with throwing the big race by the stereotypical upper-class Englishman Anthony Anstey, who represents the upstart American. Meanwhile, George's love interest, Goldie Gates, is forced by her mother, Mrs. Kenworthy, to become engaged to a dud of a rich Englishman. Surprisingly, the bad guys get their due and the true blue American is found innocent by the fall of the final curtain. Cast: Anthony Anstey, Jerry H. Cohen, Sing Sing, J. Bernard Dillon, Timothy D. McKee, Sam J. Ryan, Henry Hapgood, Donald Bryan, The Unknown, Tom Lewis, Johnny Jones, George M. Cohen, Mrs. Andrews Kenworthy, Helen F. Cohen, Flora Belle Fly, Julie Shattuck, Uh, Also, and then we have Edith Tyler, Rosario Fawcett, and Earl of Bloomsbury, Ethel Levy. Along with Jerome Kern, George M. Cohan contributed a distinctly American flavor to the embryonic musical theater form, a welcome break from operettas whose plots were often revolved around class issues and were finding themselves increasingly passé. By breaking with the European traditions of William Gilbert and Sir Arthur Sullivan, Jacques Offenbach and the Strausses, both Cohan and Kern introduced Tin Pan Alley melodies and American stories to the theater-going public, with farcical elements that were precursors to today's situation comedies. Lyrics containing current slang also helped to lower the often high-pitched emotional levels of the somewhat staid operetta form. Cohan had written two other musicals, The Governor's Son, 1901, and Running for Office, 1903. But neither was a success, and Broadway took little notice. With Little Johnny Jones, Cohan reached his stride. He wrote the book, composed the score, directed, and co-produced with Sam H. Harris. The show composed the score, directed, and the show further refined by his formula, mixing a healthy dose of patriotism with a strong dash of farce and liberal spanking of good old American corn. After Cohan read a newspaper story about the American jockey Todd Sloan, he joined up with producer Sam H. Harris, beginning a long and fruitful collaboration. Cohan wrote the entire score without the customary interpolations or the heretofore expected vaudeville turns, which usually intruded. A less original plot of the period would have found Johnny returning to London in the cast's last act to win the Derby once and for all. In Little Johnny Jones, the hero loses the race, fair and square. Today's audiences are familiar with Little Johnny Jones via the Cohan movie biography Yankee Doodle Dandy, starring James Cagney. Although much of the screenplay is simply Hollywood fiction, Cohan didn't want either of his wives to be depicted in the film, the last scene of the second act of Little Johnny Jones is quite faithfully represented. After a signal flare from his detective friend, named the Unknown, indicates Anstey's guilt in framing Johnny, our hero lets loose with a rousing reprise of Give My Regards to Broadway. Once the show established itself as a Broadway hit, Cohan, for the first time billed above the title and not as one of the four Cohans, took Little Johnny Jones on tour. That's where he enjoyed performing the most, before audiences who were thrilled to see a talent they had watched grow up before their eyes, season after season. The money on the road wasn't too bad either. And when he got the urge, he could always bring the show back to Broadway, which he did 3 more times. All told, Little Johnny Jones played more than 240 performances on Broadway, and a long run for the time. The show featured the first hit standard to come from an American musical, Life's a Funny Proposition After All, and Give My Regards to Broadway. The musical theater was on the road to becoming a true native art form. George M. Cohan. In the first 3 decades of the century, George M. Cohan was the symbol of American ingenuity, can-do attitude, and patriotic fervor. Cohan did it all. Producer, writer, director, actor, dancer, singer, and songwriter. And he did all of his jobs brilliantly. The Cohan persona, brash, energetic, sentimental, and naive, was the same on stage and off. Cohan fought off his ideals, even when he was on the wrong side of the issue. During actors' strike of 1919, he naively took the side of management and later received special dispensation from Actors' Equity. Cohan grew up in a theatrical family, the 4 Cohans, along with his parents, Nellie and Jerry, and his sister Josie accompanied him from vaudeville to Broadway. His first wife, Ethel Levy, also became part of the Cohan troupe. Cohan's shows were an important transition from European operetta to the American vernacular. Among his most important songs are Over There, Give My Regards to Broadway, The Yankee Doodle Boy, You're a Grand Old Flag, and Mary's a Grand Old Name. Early in his career, he wrote, produced, and acted in his own shows. But he and his producing partner, Sam H. Harris, presented other works as well. He acted in two historic productions, the only two that he did not write, Eugene O'Neill's Ah Wilderness and Richard Rogers and Lawrence Hart's musical I'd Rather Be Right. He is immortalized in the James Cagney film Yankee Doodle Dandy and the musical George M. Backstage, A. L. Erlanger asked George M. Cohen sarcastically, "Think you could write a play without a flag?" Cohen responded, "I could write a play without anything but a pencil." The show was revived on Broadway in 1982 with Dondi Osmond in the lead in a production that had originated at the Goodspeed Opera House. Unfortunately, it only lasted one performance. Little Me, November 17th, 1962, at the Luntfontein Theatre with 257 performances. Produced by Fear and Martin. Music by Cy Coleman. Lyrics by Carolyn Lee. Book by Neil Simon. Based on a novel by Patrick Dennis. Music orchestrated by Ralph Burns. Dance arrangements by Fred Werner. Vocal arrangements by Clay Warnick. Musical director Charles Stanford. Directed by Cy Fair and Bob Fosse. Choreographed by Bob Fosse. Scenic design by Robert Randolph. Costume design by Robert Fletcher and lighting design by Robert Randolph. Synopsis. The top-heavy Belle Schlumpfert has a mighty urge to get ahead in life. She loves Noble Eggleston, but he was born on the right side of the tracks, the far right, and she on the wrong. She marries Fred Poitras, who dies in World War I by getting his fingers caught in the keys of a typewriter. Next, she marries French chauffeur Vaudeval, who perishes when the liner Gigantic sinks. Then she meets Prince Czerny of Rosenweg, finally garnering a little. At last, ready for the Noble, she is about to toast her impending nuptials when Noble becomes an instant alcoholic and a bum. There's nothing left for Belle but to marry George Musgrove, who's had her number since the first act. Noble's son and Belle's daughter end up having a romantic finish their parents could never achieve. Cast: Patrick Dennis, Peter Turgeon. Belle today, Nancy Andrew. Mama, Adriana Rice. Belle baby, Virginia Martin. Noble Eggleston, Mr. Princhley, Valdeval, Fred Portrine, Otto Schnitzler, Prince Czerny, Noble Jr., Sid Caesar. Mrs. Eggleston, Nancy Cushman. Princhley Jr., defense lawyer, German officer, production assistant, Yolnik, Mickey Deems. Bernie Bushbaum, Joey Fay. Bernie Bushbaum, Joey Fay, Benny Bushbaum, Mort Marshall. George Musgrove, Sven Svensson. Little Me was a bright spot in the 1962-63 Broadway season, and it's considered by many to be the funniest musical ever written. It is not easy to write a truly funny musical, for the libretto is by necessity an outline linking the songs together, leaving little room for funny business. In fact, the librettist's credit for the book of 42nd Street, 1980, reads, "Leads in and crossovers by Michael Stewart and Mark Bramble," acknowledging the low spot of the totem pole that the book writer can occupy. Lyrics, too, are extremely difficult to make funny, especially smart and funny. There aren't a lot of truly hilarious book shows. A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, 1962, come to mind. It works so well because the show follows the rules of farce, so the exposition, by definition, is funny. The characters and their needs are over the top, and the story accelerates at an increasingly manic pace. Book writer Larry Gilbert is a master of verbal humor, and so is composer-lyricist Stephen Sondheim. And between them, they still left lots of room for the performers to make the roles in Forum their own. Of Thee I Sing, 1931, and How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, 1961, are funny because they're satires, not because their characters actually say funny things. Guys and Dolls, 1950, is funny because it's incredibly stylized, yet also incredibly real. Some shows, like Sugar, 1972, an adaptation of a brilliant funny film, weren't particularly well written, but the authors left enough leeway so that when the clowns were sent in, they landed the comedy successfully. If you read the scripts of As the Girls Go, 1948, Whoopi, 1928, DuBarry Was a Lady, 1939, and Foxy, 1964, you might chuckle once or twice. But in reality, they were funny for the same reason that Sugar was. They were excellent vehicles for Bobby Clark, Eddie Cantor, and Bert Lahr, brilliant clowns all. The Producers, 2001, is a damn funny show, but somehow a little less so than the movie. City of Angels, 1989, was extremely clever, but as a rule, cleverness is more admired than laughed at. Mirth-inducing lyrics are even harder to produce than laugh-out-loud libretti, given the restrictions of music, rhyme, scheme, and scansion. The funniest lyricists, in no particular order, are Leo Robin, who is in that rare camp of lyricists that could actually make a joke within a song, with some of his lyrics for The Girl in Pink Tights actually making one laugh out loud. Stephen Sondheim, a brilliant wit whose humor relies on wordplay and mostly benign ridicule of human foibles. Marshall Barer, who could write an extremely funny song, listen to The Mad Show 1966 or Once Upon a Mattress 1959 for proof. David Zippel, an extremely clever lyricist, some might say too clever, who wrote the funny and smart lyrics of City of Angels 1989. And Carolyn Lee, the lyricist of Little Me, who rose to the challenge of Neil Simon's book to pen some of the funniest and sweetest lyrics ever heard on Broadway. Little Me starred the comically gifted Sid Caesar along with an excellent supporting cast of clowns, including Nancy Andrews, Virginia Martin, Joe Fay, Mikey Deems, and Mort Marshall. It employs all manners of humor, exaggeration, incongruity, surprise, slapstick, situational humor, ridicule, satire, and wordplay. The show also gave free rein to Caesar, who brought his special talents for improvisation and slapstick. And there's one more ingredient in the mirthful mix, the breather. Sven Svensson's character isn't funny, just show-stoppingly sexy, providing the audiences with a much-needed break from all the laughs. Finally, Little Me isn't as pushy as The Producers, which is positively hell-bent on reducing the audiences to hysteric, or else. It's a gentler show, one that earns its laugh in an utterly honest manner. Unlike many of its counterparts, it truly merits the title of musical comedy. Carolyn Lee. Widely talented, yet with a reputation for being poisonously difficult, the witty lyricist Carolyn Lee collaborated on pop songs like Young at Heart before segueing to Broadway with Peter Pan in 1954. Although much of her and Moose Charlep's score was supplemented by Stein, Comden, and Green, she contributed greatly to the proceedings with her infectious word, I Gotta Crow, I Won't Grow Up, and I'm Flying. After contributing to several reviews and writing more pop songs, often with Cy Coleman, she and Coleman hit Broadway, first writing some rejected spec songs for Gypsy, including the Tony Bennett hit Firefly, before contributing the songs for the Lucille Ball vehicle Wildcat in 1960. With such catchy, jaunty songs as Hey Look Me Over and Give Me a Whistle, the team seemed a natural for the verve of musical theater. With Little Me 2 years later, Lee revealed a wickedly comic side, matching Neil Simon's hysterical book singer for the singer. The songs on the other side of the tracks, To Be a Performer, reworked and from the rejected Gypsy score, Real Live Girl, and I've Got Your Number, were perfectly for the smart-ass, comically loose style of Sid Caesar and company, teaming with Elmer Bernstein on the thoroughly mediocre How Now Dow Jones, 1967. Lee's word and Bernstein's music clearly outshone the rest of the show. After writing 2 new songs for the 1982 revival of Little Me, she teamed with Marvin Hamlish in 1985 to write Smile, 1986. The score nearly complete, her death prompted Hamlish to write a completely new score with Howard Ashman. Nancy Andrews. The wonderful comedian Nancy Andrews made her Broadway debut in the Quick Flop Hilarities in 1948, with a much better showcase for her talents the next season in Touch and Go 1949. Andrews won all the reviews for her showstopper, Miss Platt Selects Mate, replacing in Gentlemen Before Blondes and Hazel Flagg when Benet Venuta vacated during its summer hiatus. She next appeared on Broadway in Plain and Fancy, 1955, winning laughs with the song City Mouse, Country Mouse. She replaced a miscast Helen Traubel in Pipe Dream, 1955, and many said her presence in the role of Flora made the show fall into place. Two flops followed, the serious Juno, 1959, and the seriously bad Christine, 1960. Also appearing off-Broadway in the title role of the early Jerry Herman musical Madame Aphrodite, 1961, Andrews was a campy hoot at the older Belle Poitrine in Little Me, singing a rousing title duet with her younger self. Her last Broadway job was an understudy to Mildred Natwick and Lillian Roth in the short-lived 70 Girls 70, 1971. A Little Night Music opened February 25th in 1973 at the Majestic Theatre with 601 performances. Produced by Harold Prince, produced in association with Ruth Mitchell, music and lyrics by Stephen Sondheim, book by Hugh Wheeler, suggested by the film Smiles of a Summer Night by Ingmar Bergman, music orchestrated by Jonathan Tunick, musical director Harold Hastings, directed by Harold Prince, choreographed by Patricia Birch, scenic design by Boris Aronson, costume design by Florence Klotz, and lighting design by Theron Musser. Months after his marriage to Anne, lawyer Frederick Egerman finds himself increasingly frustrated. It seems that Anne is still protecting her virginity. It is a May-December romance, and Anne is actually closer in age to Frederick's also frustrated son, Henrik. As Frederick's patience slowly crumbles, a theater company comes to town starring none other than Desiree Armfeldt, an old lover of Frederick's. Desiree is having an affair with a hussar, Carl Magnus Malcolm, an underrepresented chauvinist who is married to Charlotte. Desiree's illegitimate daughter, Frederica, please note the similarity to Desiree's ex-lover's name, is ensconced with her grandmother, Madame Arnfeldt. While Desiree tours the hinterlands, they all wind up spending a weekend in the country at Madame Arnfeldt's, and the complex couplings soon sort themselves out. Anne running away with Henrik, Carl Magnus back with his wife, and Frederick with Desiree. Cast: Frederica Armfeldt, Judy Cahan; Madame Arnfeldt, Hermione Gingold; Henrik Egerman, Mark Lambert; Anne Egerman, Victoria Mallory; Frederick Egerman, Len Caro; Petra, D. Jamin Bartlett; Desiree Arnfeldt, Glynis Johns; Count Carl Magnus Malcolm, Lawrence Guittard; Countess Charlotte Malcolm, Patricia Elliott; Frid, George Lee Andrews. Once upon a time, Broadway musicals were the primary suppliers of American popular songs, with any Broadway show worth its salt containing at least one future standard. Among the earliest were 1891's Robin Hood, which gave us Oh Promise Me. The Merry Widow, 1907, offered Waltz at Maxim's, and The Girl from Utah, 1914, provided the hit They Didn't Believe Me. These songs and many, many more from early Broadway musicals entered the hit parade and remained favorites until the rise of rock and roll and the singer-songwriters forever changed the face of the popular music in the early 1960s, though the Beatles did record Till There Was You from the Music Man. By the 1970s, the record companies had largely abandoned their classical jazz and show catalogs. The variety shows was banished from television, and radio stations had switched over to rock and news formats. The last popular song to come from a Broadway show might just be One Night in Bangkok from Chess, which opened in 1988. And while some producers hold out hope that scores by immensely popular singer-songwriters like Paul Simon and Elton John might contribute to the Billboard charts, it hasn't come to pass. Stephen Sondheim, by general consensus the greatest Broadway songwriter of our time, maybe of all time, has had only one pop song come out of a show for which he created both words and music. Send in the Clowns from A Little Night Music. Recorded by Judy Collins after the show had left the boards, it won a Grammy Award for the Song of the Year in 1975, a year after the show had closed. Collins' benign folk-like rendition of Send in the Clowns, although responsible for the song's immense popularity, is in many ways the antithesis of its meaning of the show. Sondheim himself was surprised by its hit status, for it was originally written late in rehearsal at a bitter musing for the character of Desiree, and a small song, musically speaking, tailored to the wispy, honey-dipped vocals of actress Glynis Johns, completely at odds with the straight-haired, crunchy granola macram world of Collins' recordings. The original Broadway production of Night Music was witty, romantic, and one of the most elegant musicals to ever be seen on Broadway. The show was perfectly cast. From the three leads of Johns, Lee Caro, and Hermione Gingold, though the crystal-voiced ingenue of Victoria Mallory and the shiny tenor of juvenile Mark Lambert, who, like their onstage counterparts, ended up together in real life as well. The Count of Lawrence Guittard, with a perfect pomposity and baritone of operatic proportions, and the Countess of Patricia Elliott, who, not taking anything away from her marvelous performance, was provided with dialogue by Hugh Wheeler that is among the most surefire in the history of theater. In actor terms, the role is known as a gimme. Add into the mix a delightful quintet of leader singers, a precocious daughter, a lusty maid, and one of the most beautiful physical productions ever, with Boris Aronson's gliding panel of birch trees, flossy Clot's sumptuous costumes, and the legendary Theron Musser evocation of the eternal Swedish summer night. If you got a commercial and critical hit, it has even converted longtime Sondheim sorehead, Clive Barnes of the New York Times, who finally opened his eyes and ears and recognized the importance of the Prince-Sondheim collaboration, exclaiming in his rave reviews, "Good God, finally an adult musical." Long announced for a Broadway revival, first starring Lee Remick and later Glenn Rose, we still await a first-class, open-ended production. Imagine the show starring Meryl Streep, Kevin Kline, and Angela Lansbury. Hermione Gingold, who made her tour hilarious, made her Broadway debut in the review with John Mary Anderson's Almanac in 1953, where her numbers Witch Witch, her coronation as Miss Rheingold, and Dinner for One, her sketch with fellow ham Bailey DeWolf, made Gingold the toast of the town. Difficult to cast due to her unique looks and delivery, her musical was not until 1959, where she played Mrs. Bennet in The Mother of Five Daughters in First Impressions, followed quickly by a brief run in the flop review From A to Z. She replaced Molly Picon in Milk and Honey and had a non-musical success in Oh Dad, Poor Dad. A frequent guest on talk shows through the 1960s, she regaled audiences with her skills as a raconteur and her persona of a dotty, sometimes smutty aunt that one alternately adores and is embarrassed by. She won the creators of the Little Night Music over in her audition, for they had an entirely different type of mind for the role of Madame Arnfeld. It gave her career a jolt, proving she could rein in her comic bravura and be truly touching. Florence Klotz, costume designer of many of the historic Hal Prince shows, started out as a costume supervisor at City Center, making her debut as a Broadway musical designer with Prince's It's a Bird, It's a Plane, It's Superman in 1966. For her staggering Ziegfeldian inspirations for Follies, undisputedly the most beautiful designed Broadway musical ever, Klotz's place in the history would be guaranteed had she never designed another show. In addition to her sumptuous work for Follies, her red dresses for leading ladies became her signature. For Alexis Smith in Follies, the ladies of Jerry's Girls, Teresa Stratas in Rags, Chita Rivera in Kiss of the Spider Woman, Georgia Brown in Rosa, and Rebecca Luker in Prince's 1994 revival of Showboat. One of the most famous costumes in modern musical theater history, the red sequin dress in which Glynis Johns delivered Send in the Clowns in A Little Night Music, never failed to elicit gasps from the audiences. Backstage. On the national tour, Madame Arnfield was played by Wicked Witch of the West, Margaret Hamilton. When she was cast, Stephen Sondheim quipped, "She's never had a liaison in her life." The 1991 LA production featured original Desiree Glynis Johns, now graduated to the role of Madame Arnfield. Lost in the Stars opened October 30th in 1949 at the Music Box Theater with 273 performances. Produced by the Playwrights Company. Book and lyrics by Maxwell Anderson. Music by Kurt Weill. Based on the novel Cry, the Beloved Country by Aled Patron. Music orchestrated and arranged by Kurt Weill. Choral group trained by Maurice Levine. Directed by Rubel Mamoulian. Choreographed by Laverne French. Scenic design by Jerome Jenkins. Costume design by Anna Hill Johnstone. Johannesburg backdrop by Horace Armistead. Synopsis. Black minister Stephen Khumalo has lost touch with his son, Absalom, who left his home for Johannesburg to earn money for school and hasn't been heard from since. He leaves the capital to search for his son, and at the train station, Khumalo runs into James Jarvis, a white liberal lawyer, and his two sons, Arthur and Edward. Soon, in a burglary gone wrong, Absalom murders Arthur Jarvis. Absalom is captured, and Khumalo finds his son in jail, awaiting execution. Eventually, Khumalo and James Jarvis must come to terms with their lives as they attempt to understand the polarization of whites and black in apartheid South Africa. Cast. Leader, Frank Roan. Stephen Khumalo, Todd Duncan. James Jarvis, Leslie Banks. John Khumalo, Warren Coleman. Alex, Herbert Coleman. Linda, Sheila Geis. Matthew Khumalo, William Greaves. Absalom Khumalo, Julian Mayfield. Irina, Ines Matthews. The late 1930s and the 1940s were a time of experimentation in the theater. When Broadway was still a force in American culture, generally attracting highly educated people with a genuine interest in ideas who were drawn to serious themes in their art. With their events in Europe preceding and surrounding World War II, the more evolved realized that in order for humanity to survive, we must not only stand up for our beliefs, but must take responsibility for our actions. Musical theater concerned itself less with lofty goals than did straight plays, but they were definitely brave new voices to be heard. Two of the boldest examples of issue musicals were Porgy and Bess and Lost in the Stars, which shared many elements. Reuben Mamoulian directed both productions. Todd Duncan, the original Porgy, starred as Stephen Khumalo in the new show, and Warren Coleman, who had played Crown in Porgy, played Stephen Khumalo's brother in Stars. Lost in the Stars was the first and last show to be dubbed a musical tragedy by its creators, composer Kurt Weill and lyricist librettist Maxwell Anderson, who used the term to distinguish it from musical comedy. Certainly, it does deal with tragedy, but despite its examination of the horrors of apartheid, by the end of the evening, the white and black protagonists have come to a tentative understanding. Weill began his career in the political or agitprop theater of Germany, partnering with playwright Bertolt Brecht, and continued to explore serious themes in his American works. Anderson, one of the finest playwrights of his generation, was also deeply believed in the goodness of the common man, despite the obstacles he must overcome. Together and separately, they wrote shows espousing their deeply felt political and societal ideas, reaching a broad audience. While they certainly craved commercial success, they were equally interested in delivering a message. Whale and his collaborators, Anderson, Paul Green and Ira Gershwin, Alan J. Lerner, and Ogun Dash, believed in, if not a serious musical theater, at least one that spoke to its audience in a mature, intelligent way and was unafraid to deal with serious ideas in an entertaining manner. 55 years later, Whale and Anderson's Lost in the Stars continued to challenge and thrill with its soaring melodies and deeply felt story. Backstage, many of the songs in Lost in the Stars came from an unfinished score by Whale and Anderson titled Ulysses Africanus, which was meant to star Paul Robeson. Todd Duncan, a serious singer with a fervent sense of right and wrong, confidence in his fellow blacks, and an unswerving faith in the possibilities of mankind, Todd Duncan graced the Broadway stage with a strong presence and commanding voice. He made an auspicious Broadway debut in the title in a role in Porgy and Bess. After a run at London's Drury Lane Theatre in The Sun Never Sets, 1938, he returned to Broadway in the Vermont Duke John Latouche musical Cabin in the Sky, 1940, starring as the Law General opposite Ethel Waters and Dooley Wilson. He returned to Porgy and Bess on Broadway in the historic 1943 revival and in subsequent productions worldwide, acting as an unofficial ambassador of the culture. Also essaying many opera roles and appearing in few films, he played his last Broadway role in the powerful Lost in the Stars. Occasional concerting alternated with teaching at the prestigious Howard University in Washington, D.C.